How do everybody? Hope you're all keeping well. Another new episode today. I'm speaking to retired police officer Jamie Allan, who was in the police just over 4 decades, various different departments, etc. Really, really amazing kind of career journey, and a lot of people have contacted the page recently about this sort of career, so one for you guys. And please give me a wee comment and let me know what you think of it, and hit the subscribe button. Big thanks as always to Paul at Let Me Repair for the sponsorship. Check them out on Instagram, or you can have a look on their website. Cheers, guys. Jamie, thank you very much for agreeing to come on.
No problem, you're welcome.
I had a lot of people randomly message the podcast page about maybe 3 weeks ago to say, can you get somebody on from kind of frontline services? And I think it goes back to that. I tend to get a lot of school leavers that will message in and be like, oh, get someone from ambulance or police or the fire service, because I want to know what the actual, not what my careers officer tells me, I want to know what an actual policeman has been through in his career journey. And randomly you kindly messaged the page at the same time, and I've never had an easier connection to make an interview for people.
Well, no problem.
So when we obviously spoke, you've went through from being a police officer to CID to surveillance. You've took the full career journey through there. How did you join the police in the first place? What was the story behind it?
Well, back in the dark days of the late 70s in 1978, or the year preceding that, I was at business college at what's now the university at the top of Buchanan Street.
Yep.
Cali. It was a business college at that time. So I was doing a business studies course there or something. That wasn't going well because one of the content was financial based, which wasn't really my thing.
Right.
So I was looking for something else. And I think, as I've said to guys before, mainly I joined the police on a whim, really. Probably more so to annoy the life out of my father, who didn't want me to join the police.
Right.
So I just went ahead and applied, and I got accepted. I mean, in 1978, the police wages, starting wages, were really poor. I don't know what they'd equate to now, but a week, my first week's wages was £35 in 1978. Wow. So it wasn't a lot of money. Yeah. But it seems like yesterday, to be honest with you. I can remember it so well. I remember the first day. I remember going to Oxford Street, which was just across the bridge from the bottom end of St Enoch Square, across the pedestrian bridge there, and into what was Strathclyde Police Training. Initially, as I remember, I think you did a 2-week training there. Which was other cops playing at being bad guys, and they had a car in the backyard which was tiny and all the rest of it, and just a lot of lectures and stuff like that about how to be a policeman. Yeah. And I remember spending that first 2 weeks with this sergeant whose name was Tom Duff. I presume he's dead now, but the whole 2 weeks, all he went on about was the worst place you can get sent to is Saracen. Right. Saracen Police Office, which is in Possilpark. And he went on and on and on about, oh, it's murder there. It's just never stops. It's a crazy place. And I'm like, I know it's coming here. So at the end of the 2 weeks, I'm top of the pile. Alphabetically, he shouts out, Constable Allan. And I went, yes, sir. He said, I've got your posting here. And he starts laughing. Right. And I'm like, okay, where am I going? And he went, Saracen, Mary Hill Division. I went, okay, fine. So I remember getting taken to Mary Hill police office with my police issue haircut and all my stuff, and arriving there. And I remember the chief inspector, a guy called George Boyce, he said to me, right, son, no, it's no here you're working at Saracen. I thought I'd bluffed it, I thought they'd take me to Mary Hill and I was going to say nothing at that point, and I might have got away with it. But he obviously looked at the paperwork and he went, no, it's Saracen you're going to. So he took me in the car And I remember he drove up Maryhill Road, and for some reason he drove down Maryhill Road, not Possil Road.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember coming in from the top end of Saracen Street, and I can remember it so clearly because, first of all, I'd heard about this place and I'd expected it to be like, you know, the Wild West. I was expecting folk lying about the ground and stuff like that. And I remember actually driving down into Saracen Street, and it was so clean. There was no litter, the road surface, everything was really clean. And it was busy. There were lots of people about because it was a busy place at that time. Possilpark, you had 2 or 3 engineering works. You had the blind craft, which was where people who are blind or partially sighted worked, doing all sorts of things in there. There was loads of people buzzing about. Although as we got closer to the actual office and closer to the cross, and I started to see some of what would then, as it transpired, become some of my regular clientele, I thought, aye, okay, I get what you're saying here, you know. And I'd been brought up outside Glasgow. I was brought up in a place called Lenzie. Sort of middle-class suburbia. Yeah. I had no idea.
Eye-opener.
I had no idea what I was coming into.
Aye.
Totally no idea.
And why did your dad not want you to join?
Because he wanted me to follow him into the knicker selling business.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where he made his mark then.
As I used to say to teachers at school, he travelled in ladies' underwear. When they asked me what he did, I says, no, he doesn't actually travel in them, he sells them, you know. That got me a few strokes of the belt from time to time. But so I arrived there, and I remember the first day going into the office, and you come into this room and it's called a muster room. So all the troops were there, everyone gathered, and my shift would come in. This was my first actual day working. Yeah. So I just thought, right, that's a seat. I'll sit down in that seat. Aye. No, you can't sit there, son. Right. Okay, pick another seat. Picked another seat. Can he sit there? This went on for about 10 or 15 minutes before I found a seat I was allowed to sit in. Right. Because everybody had their own seats. Ah, right, okay. All the old cops and all the regular cops had their own seats. Right. So that's where they sat. Right, okay. Whether it's still like that now, I've no idea. And the sergeant would then come in and he would give you a briefing and tell you where you were going to be working and was there anything you were looking out for. I mean, it's very old school, you know. I understand now they do it in probably electronic briefing, most of it now. But that's the way it was, and then you basically get sent out to your beat. And that's how it started for me. And how was that, obviously, as you said yourself, coming from Lenzie to then being on the beat in Saracen? That's a very different place as to where you came from. But what were your initial kind of memories and feelings as well? Because obviously... My feelings? I was terrified. Aye. I was literally shaking in my trousers at times. Aye. You know, I mean, I've heard other guys saying that, you know, they loved it from day one. But a lot of these guys were brought up in, you know, schemes in Glasgow. Aye. So used to it? They were used to it. Aye. I wasn't used to it. So it took me a long time to feel comfortable with in my own skin in working as a uniformed officer in Saracen. But I was very, very fortunate because the two main guys I worked with were older cops. One a guy called Hughie Harkins, I think he's still alive actually. He'd come down from the Highlands. He'd been a fisherman, right? And like a lot of people coming down from the Highlands of the Western Isles, they came to Glasgow to make their money. And he joined the police because it was a regular job with a regular income. Yeah. But as I say, at that time, not a very good income. Yeah. But these two guys were great with me because what they did was they basically taught you the rules of the street. Yeah. And that was how it worked in those days. And the way it worked in those days was basically, we call the shots here, we rule. Yeah. We're the biggest gang, so we're in charge of what's going on here. And there was etiquette to even walking along the street. I remember walking along the street one day And the two of us were walking towards one of the local worthies. And I remember Eddie Murphy, who was the other guy, grabbing my hand.
Right.
And he'd a vice-like grip. He was he'd been a soldier in Korea and all the rest of it. So this guy had been about, and he grabbed my hand, and I thought he was going to crush my hand. And he pulled me right towards him. And the guy walked round us, and he said to me, never ever let anybody walk in between you. Never let that happen. He says, because they might turn around and put something on the back of your head, like a bottle or something like that. And that was one of the sort of things that you learnt straight away. So I had a big settling in period there. The way it worked back then was you did your 2 years, well, I presume it's still the same, you do your 2 years probation. So when you went to work at Saracen, you were a rookie, like I was. You weren't allowed to work on your own until about you did 6 months. And you worked on your own, basically on the late shift. After a certain time, you neighboured up, but the first part of the late shift was 2 to 11, the late shift. So you worked with a neighbour once things were starting to liven up, shall we say. And on the early shift, you worked on your own completely. On the night shift, you stayed with a neighbour until things quietened down, which sometimes they never did. Literally never did. But I remember my first night shift. I remember coming out of the office and thinking, what's going to happen here, and once things calmed down after the usual blood and thunder for the first couple of hours or whatever, there I was on my own. I came out after my peace break, which was something like 2:30 in the morning or something like that. And I remember walking up Killarn Street, and then all hell broke loose, and I couldn't think of what it was, and it was all these bombs going off all around me. I thought they were bombs. It turned out it was all the rest of the cops who'd sneaked out early, and they'd all these big massive light bulbs, and they were chucking them in the pitch black, and they were landing behind me and in front of me and everything, and I thought I was in Beirut or something like this. It was just ridiculous. But that was the sort of larks and carry-ons that went on back in those days.
I suppose that helped in a way as well,
It
though.
did help, yeah. It helped completely because it broke the ice for you, and you knew, what was coming in terms of, what you should expect working on your own. So that was me in my first night shift, and that was followed shortly thereafter by you used to have to check your properties. So the police were responsible. The one thing you were taught was you're there to guard, watch and patrol. Right? And I thought, how does that work? So we're looking after these people's property for them when they go home. So the police were sort of unpaid security guards, but that was accepted for years and years. And I remember going round the back of these properties in Saracen Street, and the tenement properties in Saracen Street were very, very run down at that time. They were getting to the stage where they were almost becoming slums. And I remember going round the back with my torch, and it must have been by that time at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I thought, I'm seeing things. I must be getting really, really tired here, because that floor looks like it's moving, like the ground looks like it's moving. So I sort of rubbed my eyes and shone my torch again, and I looked, and I've never seen so many rats in one place in my life. There must have been 100 or more of these things, just like a plague of them going across. So I went, aye, everything's all right. Get back out of there. Sharpish, So the early days were in uniform in those days. It was very much the case, as I say, that you were there to show the public a visible presence, and you were there to deal with what was going to happen. On the late shifts, that involved things like you had to go into the pubs. So the pubs would shut then, I think, at 10 o'clock at night. And you'd drink up time till 15:15. So we would go into the pubs in our beat and actually tell people they had to leave, stop drinking, you're over your time. And I remember the first time walking into one of these pubs, and it was all they were all growling, you know, and you could hear it, and the bottles were whizzing past your head, you know, but that's these guys, you know, and my neighbours, the old neighbours, your reaction, I want to get out of here.
Aye.
And they were like, no,
Aye.
this is the way, chest up,
Aye.
head up, just walk through
Aye.
it. Because as soon as you saw if you showed any sign of weakness, that was you finished.
Aye.
You know, they would send you to Mulgai or somewhere like that, because that was where this, basically, if you couldn't cut it in Maryhill or Saracen, they sent you to Mulgai.
It's hard though as well to try and hold your nerve in that situation if you've never been in it.
It was exceptionally difficult, really, really difficult. But these guys gave you the confidence to do it, because they'd done it hundreds of times, and they were comfortable with it. And a lot of them had been there that long that they knew by that time that even when they were throwing bottles at you, they were probably carefully aimed, because they didn't actually want to hit you.
Yeah.
Because if they hit you, then that was going to be not good for them. You know, it was going to be a bad day.
Yeah.
Because, you know, as I say, they took it that they were the people who were controlling what was going on, and that was it. But they were also good at helping me in terms of giving me advice. And one of the first pieces of advice I remember them giving me was, treat everybody the same, treat them with respect.
Yeah.
Don't mishandle people, don't abuse them. You know, if you're going to arrest somebody, basically, their attitude was, you're taking away their liberty. And that's the worst thing you can do to anybody.
Yeah.
That noise of somebody slamming a cell door on anybody, that's a pretty final sounding thing.
Definitely.
You're not going anywhere. And that stuck in my head, but I was never like that anyway. There were some cops who wanted to be argumentative, you know, and funnily enough, I was talking to an ex-colleague yesterday. He's my son-in-law's husband, son-in-law's father, and we were talking about that, and he said, yeah, you know, it's funny because you worked with other guys who just wanted to get into a situation and wanted to be aggressive on the front foot all the time. And that was another thing they said to me, you can't do that in every situation.
Yeah.
You always get into a situation and you try and be the nice guy initially. You try and talk your way through it. As you can see, I don't have a problem talking. So it was fine for me. That was the thing that always got me out of trouble in these situations. I would talk to the Neds, as they called them, right? I would talk to them on their own level. That's the other thing they said to me, never talk down to people, because as soon as you talk down to people, you've lost it. Yeah. I worked with another guy who does zoology degree, believe it or not. Right. And he had joined accelerated promotions. He never actually got promoted, but the idea of that scheme was based on something the Metropolitan Police had, that you would come in as a graduate and you would pass your police exams and you would go through the ranks rapidly, which a lot of people who ended up as senior officers did. Yeah. But this guy just didn't have a clue. Right. He couldn't stop himself getting into bother, not in the malicious sense. Yeah. But because he'd a very, very cultured, posh voice. Right. And as soon as he started talking to them, you know, saying to them, now chaps, come on, you need to tone this down and all this sort of stuff. You know, that was it.
Never going to work.
It's never going to work. And they just ripped the proverbial out of this guy, and everybody had to then go and rescue him because he'd end up trying to arrest people and he just couldn't do it. Yeah. So I think it was about that two-way thing. For me, that was the best thing. Yeah. In those early days was that communication with people. That's what I really enjoyed. I enjoyed talking. I still do now. I enjoy talking to people and I try to find their backstory. Yeah. You know, even some of the really heavy guys that I've dealt with over the years, you could have a conversation with them. Yeah. As long as you weren't asking them, did they do something or were they responsible or general, just having a chat off tape or whatever with them. And it was really quite fascinating sometimes to find out how they'd come to where they were. Yeah. And as I say, I had this expectation that it was going to be the Wild West, but it wasn't. You in typical sort of police manner of those days, a lot of the more older, cynical type cops would say everybody in Saracen's just an Ed. Everybody that lives in Possilpark are just Neds, which was complete and utter rubbish. Because the majority of people who I ever came across, probably 95% of them, were good, honest, decent people just trying to go about their business and get on with their lives. Amidst all the nonsense that was going on. But at that time, back in the late 70s, it was mainly low-level crime in Saracen. There was nothing, no big things going on, just people breaking into houses and not so many in Saracen, usually out with and then coming back. And apart from that, occasionally, the violence after pubs.
Kind of gang culture.
Yeah, a wee bit of that. But usually it was just people falling out over drink or because they discovered that Shuey was nipping their missus or whatever it was, and it turned pear-shaped because he walked into the pub. And that was my first experience of realising that some pubs and schemes in Glasgow appear to have the biggest toilets in the world. Because I would always go in and say to people, well, did you see any? And they go, no, mate, I was in the toilet. And the whole pub was in the toilet, basically, So after a while, you just accepted that. And I mean, I always took the attitude that if I lived in one of these areas, I wouldn't have told the police anything. So I didn't, a lot of cops tried to push people to give them statements and say things and stuff like that. I never did that because I thought it was pointless. Because if you went to court, that would just get chucked out. It would get, people would go and they would say, I didn't want to give this statement, or they just wouldn't turn up. And fiscals were very reluctant to put out a warrant for somebody who was a witness. Very rarely that would happen. So as I say, it was a big change for me from where I'd been before. But, after the first few years, you settled into it very quickly.
See those first few years, do you think that that's not a rite of passage as such, but do you think that's a good grounding for anybody that wants to get into the police force to go into an area that's deemed to be rough or has a lot of poverty and a lot of trouble, to actually go in and see that from that side and work in that environment?
100%. It was the best grounding I could have had. And even all the other stuff I did, I kept coming back to areas like Possilpark, Pollock, Baird Street, which covered, all the big schemes in the north side of the city. I had started with that grounding in an area where, I was seeing everything, all sorts of stuff going on. And that gave me a good grounding. Things changed didn't change slightly, sorry, they changed in a big way in the early 80s in Saracen, though, with when drugs came into Saracen, basically. I mean, I can almost remember it, not the date, but I remember the first sort of instance of people taking drugs and heroin came into Saracen. Because by that time, Margaret Thatcher had been the Prime Minister for 2 years. Margaret Thatcher had increased the wages of the police to try and get them on side for her battle with the unions. So, there were a lot more people coming into the police and it was seen more as a career then. But in Saracen, nothing changed other than all of a sudden heroin came into Saracen. And overnight, the level of crime dropped in Saracen initially because nobody wanted, there was nothing for people to steal of any great value. They broke into people's houses and stuff like that. But most of them would either be going into the town shoplifting, or unfortunately some of the females I dealt with, they took to prostitution. So they basically went in and they were involved in the sex trade in order for them to get money for heroin. and heroin was really, really cheap.
Yeah.
You know, it was sold in tenner bags back in that day. And it was like it was akin to what we're going through now. It was like a pandemic.
Yeah.
It literally ripped through the place, and it started in Saracen and spread out throughout Glasgow and then the whole of Scotland. And everybody could see what was going on in terms of, you know, the actual spread of it so quickly. So a lot of the young bucks who were coming up, you know, and were regularly becoming our customers because they were always getting into bother, fighting with the police, fighting with each other, stealing cars, whatever they were doing. They were dead within 2 or 3 years. But there must have been a whole generation of people in that area who died by the time they were 21. It was absolutely crazy.
Yeah. And did you see when that first came in, obviously, as you said, with the heroin and things, at that point, did you yourself think it would have as lasting an impact? Or but at that point, was it more of a kind of, we don't know how long this is going to last?
I don't think anybody saw it coming.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, you know, drugs were something that you associated with the student union and the town. You know, so people were taking LSD tabs or smoking a bit of marijuana, whatever it was. But hard drugs just didn't exist at that time. So I don't think anybody had any clue. There was a very famous ex-prisoner called Jimmy Boyle. Jimmy Boyle was in the special unit at Barlinnie, and that was quite an innovative thing in the prison. And he'd been a particularly violent individual. He hadn't, you know, this was long before I joined the police, but he'd come out of Barlinnie and he'd very much got involved in this whole thing at the beginning. And I remember that he came to a meeting in Possilpark, probably at the community centre. I can't remember where it was. And the police were involved in it as well. And I remember there was a chief inspector who was there. And Jimmy Boyle stood up and said that the Tory government had introduced heroin into Glasgow in order to keep the masses down. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, you know, a lot of people thought statements like that were just so out there. But the effect it had on people, I'm not suggesting for a minute they did, don't get me wrong, but the introduction of drugs into Saracen was very quick and the spread of it was rapid. And I had the same attitude then all the way through my police service and all the stuff that I did, and we'll come to all that. And I still have it now, and that is, I believe, that if the government had had the will to deal with it, either the Westminster government or the government in Scotland, as it then became eventually when there was a Scottish Parliament, things would never have got to where they now have got to. And the people who are the kingpins of the drugs trade in Scotland and throughout this country would never have been allowed to get there. Because once these guys started making big money, I mean, a lot of these families who I'll not name for obvious reasons, but everybody knows who they are. A lot of them were from that area. Were on my beat. Some of them were based there, and they were low-level criminals. But as soon as the drugs trade started up, they started getting involved with that, and within a few years, they were all millionaires. And astounded me that it took the government so long. It took them years and years to bring in legislation to even try and get at these people. And when they did, it was weak and wishy-washy. In the Republic of Ireland, for instance, they had a different attitude when the drugs problem started over there. And eventually they brought in very sort of what people thought were draconian seizure laws and stuff like that. And their drug problem took a lot longer to grow than it did here. To compare it with something else, if you compare it with the Troubles in Northern Ireland, for instance, I had a friend who was in the police there, and he said to me that when it came to terrorism in Northern Ireland, there was no budget.
Right.
Absolutely no budget. None for the police, none for the army, MI5, all these services, because they were fighting terrorism, domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
So they couldn't have a budget for it. So if they wanted to do something and they needed a bit of kit, it didn't matter how much it cost, they would get it.
Right.
You know, but the same attitude was never taken towards drugs. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where I think, the third or fourth year in a row that Scotland has the unenviable title of having the worst drugs deaths per head of population in Europe. And, you know, I was considered to be quite political, and I was told on a number of occasions you can't voice those opinions. Well, you couldn't voice political opinions in the police. You weren't allowed to do that. But even privately amongst your peers, and people were really surprised at me when I said things like that. And I said to them, but the way you've got to look at it here is, you know, as I say, you had a lot of cynical older cops who just thought, well, fuck them.
Yeah.
If that's what they want to do, let them all die. And I said, oh, this is human beings we're talking about at the end of the day.
And you would have seen that change in people because you've been on that area. So you'd have seen, as you say, like your kind of wee guys that were doing daft things like stealing cars, etc., then accelerate through to seeing that take a grip of people and the change and the outcome, sadly, for some.
The outcome was a lost generation.
Yeah.
And because of that, then, as we're still seeing now, the impact that has upon their families in terms of maybe grannies ending up having to look after children because their parents are either unable to or they're dead. And when you combine the introduction of drugs into that area, there was also, timing-wise, all the businesses and works in that area started to disappear. Right. Not because of the drugs, just because of the economic situation. So when I went to work there in 1978, there was 3 engineering works. There was the blind craft, there was the Ascot factory in Saracen Street, and then further out in the same division up towards the Milton, there was the city bakeries and stuff like that. Massive amounts of people unemployed, employed in that area. By the time I left in 1989, they were all gone. Yeah. And drugs had then been in Saracen for about 7 or 8 years. 8 years probably. Yeah. And the place was totally changed. The whole, there was a hopelessness to a lot of people's lives. Yeah. So I personally thought that at that time, there could have been a better attitude taken to the whole thing by both the police and by government. But I wasn't in a position to voice those opinions. And it wasn't the way that policing was going in those days. Yeah. It was all about, let's hammer down on everybody, including those who are in possession of drugs. Now the thinking's changed a lot. The possession, small amounts of controlled drugs now, I think hopefully they're working towards a situation where, that should be something that they should be steering them towards treatment rather than steering them into a court and then into prison. We recently had a conversation with an ex-prison officer in here, and he said, something which I think probably everybody would know, that once somebody gets arrested and put in jail, it's easier to get drugs in the jail than it is to get them outside, and it's pretty easy to get them outside. So as I say, that changed the whole dynamics of what policing was all about. It changed it for me as well, because at that time, I started to think, maybe I want to do something else and walk on the beat here. So I did. That was at the point, I think I had my first shot of plain clothes in 1985, which was a bit of a joke because, I thought I suddenly disguised myself by putting a parka on and a pair of jeans, but the two of us were still walking as a two pair of guys walked along the road, and I was working with the most well-known guy. Right. They told him to do plain clothes with me. And I thought, this is the most ridiculous thing ever. you know, and guys were asking you, what time is it, officer, and stuff like that. So there wasn't much, it wasn't very incognito, you know, but don't get me wrong, we had a very good success rate, normally because we were in somewhere for a cup of tea and we'd walk out into somebody carrying a telly along Saracen Street or something like that, you know, we just were very, very lucky. I remember another night being in it's not there anymore, it was somewhere called the Kenmure Club, and this old cop that I worked with liked a beer. So he would always go in there in the night shift and they'd have a wee shandy or whatever, you know, which was not technically allowed, or not totally allowed. So he'd have a beer, and I remember sitting in this place and I suddenly was aware of this noise at the back fire doors, right? And I looked at him and he looked at me and he said, "Is that what I think it is?" And he said, "Aye, it is. Switch all the lights off." So switched all the lights off for this place, and 5 minutes later, this guy comes in, trying to break into the place. So we just grabbed him, and that was it, you know. And I remember taking him back to the office, and the inspector sort of looking and thinking to himself, "Why were you two there so quickly?"
Aye, very convenient.
Because we're like on the radio, "We've got a call that there's somebody trying to break into this club." And he was like looking at my neighbour going, "I know where you were," you know. But so that was my first sort of taste of working in plain clothes. I think it might have been you asked me in the sort of stuff you sent me earlier, who were my inspirations, and I think it was round about the early 80s. There was a film came out called Serpico,
right? Yep,
with Al Pacino. I remember watching that and thinking, that's for me. That's what I want to do. I mean, that was a wee bit, he took it to a bit of extremes, you know. He was disguising himself as all sorts of things, you know. But I thought, yeah, I want some of that. That's for me. And I very quickly decided that working in uniform was not what I wanted to do. And subsequently, I think it was in 1986, I got appointed to the CID. Initially appointed as an aide to the CID, so you only had a sort of acting detective constable role. Yep. And then eventually I got appointed to CID, so that was my uniform days finished at that point.
And was that still in the same area, or did you need to move at that point? Or?
No, same office.
Right.
Same office, aye.
For the kind of, from being an officer on the beat to then becoming into the CID, what were the main differences for you? Like, obviously, because it's, as much as you're still in the police and you're still essentially doing the same thing, but it's a totally different role from where you were previously.
Well, the first difference was I had to go to Ralph Slater's and buy a suit because I didn't have one. So, yeah, it was totally different. It was completely different. And it was funny because, as I say, initially I did that 6 months attachment before going back to uniform for a short period of time, then getting appointed full time as a detective constable. And straight away, you were put in no doubt that you are now a detective officer. Right. And you're a step above.
Yeah. Chain of command.
In the chain of command, in the pecking order, you're a step above. Yeah. So, have you ever seen the film or the television series Life on Mars? Essentially, that's what it was like. Right. More or less. I mean, that's it's exaggerated for dramatic effect, but a lot of what the guy wrote and the pictures he painted in it were very much what went on. You know, when you became a detective officer, it was as if you'd never been a uniformed officer, because uniformed officers were referred to in the CID as wooden tops, right? That's a Met Police thing, because it refers to the helmet that they used to wear, but it caught on up here. Right. And the detective officers, you know, were like, the wooden tops don't come through the door here. And I remember again thinking to myself, that's very strange. Why? And I was quite young then, and I remember thinking, why would you want that? Yeah. You want these guys to come and speak to you. Yeah. And I did it when I was trying to get in. I always tried to say, can I take this case on? you know, if it was just something simple like a house break and you got caught,
Mm-hmm.
there was no complicated inquiry, I would go to the CID and say, can I do this case?
Aye.
And it took a lot of persuading.
Mm-hmm.
I realised when I joined the CID that all of that was total flim-flam anyway, because they didn't want to do it, but they were just trying to make it look as if they were doing you a big favour by giving you this case to do.
Right.
Because they had enough to deal with.
Yeah.
You know? So there was a definite divide between the two departments, without a shadow of a doubt. I remember the officer in Saracen was up the stairs, and if you were a uniformed cop, you knocked the door before you went into the CID room.
Yeah.
That was the sort of awe in which these guys were dealt with. So as a young CID officer coming in, I was dealing with guys who were hardened detective officers and had been.
Yeah.
Always remember at the end of the sort of late shifts, or sometimes at the end of the early shifts as well, they would adjourn into the detective sergeant's room. And I remember going into the room and it was like that opening scene out of Life on Mars, where you walked in and there was a fog of smoke floating above, you know, the floor level and ceiling level. And then drink would be produced, you know, and you would have a couple of drinks and that was you. You were one of the lads and that was it. That was all part of the culture back in those days as well. And it was accepted to an extent, provided people weren't going over the top with it. It wasn't technically allowed. It was totally verboten, as it were, but it was accepted that when you shut that door, as long as nobody knew about it, that was fine, and it wasn't over the top. And it was basically their way of de-stressing. You know, as I've said to people many times throughout my career, that in the early days in the police, the 70s and the 80s especially, there were two ways of dealing with stress in the police. One was drink and one was women, or it was a combination of the two of them. And that unfortunately led to a lot of strife, as you can imagine. You know? And it had, eventually it changed. Obviously it had to change, you know? But it was a different thing for me to then get involved in investigating crime. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time in the CID at Saracen and Maryhill. I worked with some absolute cracking guys who I know still to this day. And I worked with some characters, some old detective officers who literally were characters, you know, who ruled the roost. And there was great sense of humour at those. We had some great laughs as well. I remember one detective inspector, he'd come in this day and he'd injured his foot doing something. Can't remember what he'd done. He walked in this day and he was always immaculate, this guy. He was always like the man from Gucci, right? He was dressed to the nines. He looked the part. And then he walked in and he had a pair of baffies on, like slippers. And everybody looked. And of course, they're trying to subdue their laughter. And he's looked like glowering at you, you know. So there was nothing really said about it. Nobody twigged, nobody said a thing to him that whole day. He came back in the next day and every single one of us was wearing slippers. And he was raging, man. He was like looking at us all going, what are you guys doing here? You know?
Probably thought he'd get away with it the night before. Like, nobody said it. Lucky escape.
It was, but that was the kind of way that people dealt with the basically the horrors that they were having to deal with. Otherwise, they just had a laugh. They did other things, like they used to take the sort of screws and bolts out of people's desks and then just sit them together, and they'd come in the morning, the whole desk would collapse underneath them, you know. Or another favourite was if they went holiday and if somebody upset somebody else, they used to get jelly from the supermarket. Get like a whole ton of this jelly and melt it and then pour it into their drawer with all their paperwork and their notebooks and everything. So when they came back from holiday, they opened their drawer and it was full of jelly. So it was just, it was great laugh as well, you know, but, you know, dealing with the actual type of work, you know, you started then to deal with the more serious crimes. So you started dealing with murder, rape, firearms, whatever it was.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a big step to take from working in uniform. But again, I was very fortunate.
Yeah.
I worked with guys who'd done it for years.
Yeah.
And what was also interesting that time was it was in the 80s that they started a pilot in Strathclyde Police to tape record interviews.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the early interviews were hilarious because nobody knew what they were doing. And many tapes were pulled and flung away because you just didn't know what you were doing. But once you got into the hang of it, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed interviewing people, especially some of the not the brightest, shall we say, who wanted to have a big conversation and try and make up a big story about how they hadn't done something instead of just saying nothing.
Aye.
You know, and that was always great sport, you know, because you would have this back and forth banter with them and all the rest of it. And we had great laughs doing that, but we worked really hard as well.
Yeah.
You know, long hours and a lot of hard work. Cases that we dealt with in the CID at that time, you know, mainly it would be murders, attempt murders, serious assaults, stuff like that.
How did you find that from being a beat officer, and at that point there was a whole kind of growth in drugs, both from people taking it, from people selling it, making money from it, to then going into the CID, and as you say, it then becomes more serious with kind of murders and sexual assaults and things like that. Psychologically, how do you deal with that? Because if you've never done it before and you're in that situation where you are speaking to people who have lost someone and they want someone caught, and you're trying to kind of live in that world with the pressure as well. But how did you cope with that?
You just put it in a box for later on.
Were you always like that, or did it take you time to get to that stage of just kind of...
No, you just had to front it up. And as I say, then you would probably go for a drink with the guys after work, and that was your way of debriefing and de-stressing the day. But as I found out later on, that doesn't really work. Yeah. Because a lot of that stuff comes back in later life and you have to deal with it then. But at that time when you're young and you think you've got a tough skin, you can deal with it. I mean, I'd never seen a dead body at that point. You know, I mean, it's when I joined the police, I'd never seen anybody dead in my life. You know, I then worked in the beat and I saw plenty of sudden deaths. And then obviously murders. So, you know, that in itself was something to deal with.
Do you ever get used to that?
No, never get used to it. And eventually in 1989, a guy came to work at Saracen, or just before 89, it'd probably been 88, and he'd been in the Scottish Crime Squad, and he started talking about it, and I thought, this is for me. Surveillance work. Yeah, I want some of that. A lot of the detectives I worked with couldn't understand why I would even be remotely. Why do you want to move from Saracen and Maryhill? A lot of guys worked their whole 30 years in the one division. Never either as a beat officer or as CID officers. So they were like, why do you want to put yourself through all that? Yeah. But I thought, no, this is what I want to do. This is where I see my career going here now. And when I say career, I wasn't particularly career or promotion minded. But I had in mind what I wanted to do in terms of the job, and it wasn't working in the same office for 30 years. That seemed to me not the way to go. So in 1989, I applied for, and with the help of this guy who'd been there, I was accepted to go and join the Scottish Crime Squad. Scottish Crime Squad, the way it was set up was basically that there were 8 forces in Scotland at that time. The biggest being Strathclyde, which I think had something roughly around about 7,500 officers. And the smallest force was Dumfries and Galloway, which had 750.
Right.
But they all had chief constables and a rank structure and all the rest of it. And sitting aside from that, you had the Scottish Crime Squad.
Mm-hmm.
So the Scottish Crime Squad's job was to deal with crime that transgressed, people who transgressed borders of these forces.
Mm-hmm.
So travelling criminals.
Yeah.
So people who were at that time could have been drug dealers.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been people just travelling housebreakers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could have been fraudsters, anything.
Yeah.
Just people who were literally travelling.
Moving around.
To Scotland and moving around, and even beyond Scotland as it transpired. And that's what I started to get involved with. Before that, we had to do specialist training in terms of your driving and surveillance course to prove that you were up to it. And a lot of guys who'd been very, very good plainclothes officers never made squad officers or surveillance officers because they just didn't have the front to do it.
Yeah.
You have to have a certain thing about you. You've got to be a bit... Some of the best guys I knew were very gallus guys, and they were excellent because you have to put yourself in close proximity to people.
Yeah.
And have the wherewithal to front that up and get away with it without them questioning who you are.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, that did happen on many occasions where they either guessed who you were or asked you who you were. But in the main, you got away with it. And the early days in that were very, very interesting. In fact, I think not very long after I started working there, I ended up very quickly back in Saracen, working with a group of guys who were basically robbing security vans all over Glasgow and beyond.
Right.
So we were trying to do a job on them. We were a bit hand-tied at that time because what you will find now, especially everybody has it now on their mobile phones and has it as a matter of course, is that things are encrypted. So people can't listen into conversations, but in those days they could.
Yeah.
So that caused us a lot of problems in terms of communicating with each other when we were trying to operate in these jobs. And it wasn't till a few years after that they basically, what they basically did was they took second-hand radio equipment from the army and they started using that.
Like CB radios and...
Well, no,
like
it was just radios that then people weren't able to listen to. So that gave you a bit more of an advantage in terms of observations and stuff like that. So that was a sort of pre-runner all those years back to now what the police use as a regular thing. Airwave radios even for beat officers and stuff like that, which now can't be scanned, just the same as when you get to use WhatsApp or something. People can't look at what you're saying. So that was made a big difference to us in the early days, and because without that type of technology, things were very difficult. But we some good operations. We had some great. I travelled all over Scotland and beyond. Had some really interesting cases that we were involved in. I was thinking of a couple of them last night, and I remember being in the office and getting a call to say there's a guy bringing drugs in to Aberdeen Airport. And I remember it was a really, really bad winter. And I remember there was two cars get sent up because this guy was coming into Aberdeen Airport. And we get sent up and we drove up through snow blizzards to get to Aberdeen, and we drove at silly speeds with the cars going sideways at points to get there in time for this guy coming off the plane. And I remember this, I can still remember it to this day because I remember I knew that this policewoman who was there working with the Grampian Drug Squad, and I remember arriving at the airport and she was standing out there. So I I was the guy who was going to work with her. So I sort of approached her and said, "Yep, this is what we know is going to happen. This guy's going to come off a plane." And this guy walked off the plane, which had come from London via Islamabad or somewhere like that, right? And he was wearing traditional Indian Pakistani clothes, Pakistani I think it was. He was of just a sort of loose shirt, very thin, and a pair of loose thin trousers on. But in one hand he had a couple of carrier bags full of dates and nuts, and in his other hand he had this brand new massive Samsonite briefcase, which, as it turned out, had 6 kilos of heroin in it. So I think even without the intelligence, somebody might have picked up on this guy, because he was the biggest stick out ever, and he had no clue where he was going or what he was doing.
Right.
And we actually ended up taking this guy in a car. At this point, he didn't know who we were. You know, he said, "Oh, you'll wait forever for getting a taxi. We'll take you into town. Where are you going to?" So he then produced a bit of paper with a restaurant's name on it and led us straight to who he was going to give the drugs to. So that was one of the more easier operations I ever dealt with.
You must have had ones as well, and this was a question that I'd got in from one of the followers of the page. Was it interesting from your point of view to understand the kind of the sheer organisation that goes into some of these kind of criminals and how they work and everything that goes on round about it? Because you'll get people, as you touched on earlier, that will look at something and think, no brains from a bad area, they don't know anything. But when you actually break it down, they're no daft at all when you kind of get right down to how they run things or how they do things.
Well, that was fascinating, yes, but generally the organisation and the idea of a higher level of criminality in terms of people smuggling drugs and dealing in drugs didn't really exist in reality. They weren't always that well organised. They didn't need to be, because once it became a regular thing, you know, it was only a matter of going, usually somewhere down in England, making a contact with somebody, doing the deal, and coming back up the road with it. That it was usually fairly simple initially. As these guys became more adept at what they were doing, then they spread their sort of contacts into a more global network. Initially European, then global. So things, what you're talking about, then that would be more involved in terms of what was going on in the background, and we had to up our game in that sense to be on top of these guys. And as I said to you before, I'm not going to get into the techniques that we used, because surveillance is still a very basic thing. You're watching people, you're following people. That's the way it goes. Everybody sees it in the television. Although it's not quite like they see it on the telly. But you know, a lot of it gives you some idea of what went on, and a lot of these operations were long standing and went on for a good period of time. But I spent 3 years in the Scottish Crime Squad from 1989 to 92, and things were still quite basic at that terms, in terms of the drug organisation and how it was organised. Because if you think, really, you were only 8 up to 11 years from the real introduction of hard drugs into Glasgow and then Scotland throughout. And at that time, during that time, also cocaine had started to come into Glasgow. But cocaine at that point was footballers' drug. It was what they were going to Vicky's for, or the dance.
Celebrity choice.
Celebrity drug of celebrity choice. It was a rich man's drug. It has now not become the rich man's drug.
Yeah.
It's now very, very cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It's as cheap now as heroin. I don't know what the current prices are. Obviously, I'm well out of that now, but they're very, very cheap.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, that idea really came about because of the fact that when they started to produce cocaine in these areas, South America and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted to flood the American market, that was their biggest market.
Yeah.
That they basically started to output so much of this stuff, and as it went on, they just had too much of it.
Yeah.
So then had to find a way of getting rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it then came into Europe, and then came into via Europe into the UK.
Yeah.
And the price, because of the amount of it, the price of it dropped through the floor.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't really matter to them because it was all money anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It was just they had to sell more of it and find more outlets for it to shift as much of it as they possibly could. I remember then working with customs and excise, as they were called at that time. That was another interesting thing for me, because when I went to work in the Scottish Crime Squad and within the police arena, there was everybody always talked about this idea of it's my ball, and we're keeping it, and we don't tell anybody anything. And to an extent, that was obvious because of the type of work we're involved in. It was always had to be kept very tight. But I thought it was very short-sighted the way the police at that point had attitude towards other agencies like Customs and Excise and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Some of it was based on the fact that these guys weren't police officers. They were civil servants who'd maybe gone into doing that type of work, and maybe the level of training wasn't what it could have been at that point. But there was still, a connection to be made. And I made a lot of these connections at that time, and fortunately went on to work with guys who then saw the benefit of that.
Yeah. And
one particular job that myself and my neighbour got sent down to in Dover. We went to Dover for an importation, and at that point, I think it was the highest one of the highest drug seizures in the UK, and certainly of Scotland. In fact, it was only surpassed a few years ago.
Right.
And it was something, I'm going to say 1/4 ton, but it was a lot of cocaine.
Yeah.
And basically what they did was they brought this stuff in barrels and bales of raw rubber. Right? Which was really bizarre stuff. It's, like the inside of a golf ball or something like, if you've ever seen that, with strands and strands of rubber, but it was thick. And basically the drugs were in the middle of this stuff. And I remember the container coming in, and they got the guys and brought this container into this big shed, and we were told, you're down there, you'll only be down there a day, you'll be back up tomorrow, you're just down there, it's an oversight because it's a joint job with them, but we want to have some input into it. And I'm like, fine, this sounds really interesting, let's go and do it. We were there for 4 days, because there was so much of this stuff inside, and basically what they were doing, it's not something that's not been seen in the television and discussed within dramas. So it's not. I'm not saying anything that's particularly secret or anything like that. But basically, what they would do a lot of the times with any concealment or like that is they would put loads of the good stuff, i.e., bales of rubber or boxes of fish or whatever it was, in a big massive container, and then right in the middle of it, you would have the stuff that contained the drugs. Yeah. So it took forever to look through this stuff. And then the stuff had to be x-rayed and then opened up. Yeah. And I think we were there for a week down in Dover. We had to go and buy, I remember we had to go and buy underwear, stuff like that, and shirts, because we had nothing to wear by the end of this job. But it was a great success.
Unbelievable.
and it set the tone for things that then transpired later on. But that was me. I left. That was my initial go at surveillance, and I left there and I went to work in Beard Street for a couple of years, doing CID work again, which I really, really enjoyed. Beard Street was a really, really busy office. And again, in the north side of the city, literally just a mile from where I'd worked at Saracen. And it was the same type of criminality that we were dealing with there again, mainly violence. There was started at that time to be a lot more sexual crime. But there was a good scope, and you were learning stuff all the time. And we did all our own cases in those days, the CID, and you would get, it was like getting your homework back, you get it marked with red pen and go and do it again, you learnt how to write a case, you learnt how to deal with all these different things. And if you didn't know, you went and asked somebody, and somebody always knew. Somebody dealt with a case. I mean, some of the random stuff that people had dealt with over the years amazed me. Some of the casework that they'd done. I discovered charges that I never knew existed. Old Scots law and charges that were could be tried in the High Court. And mainly that's what you dealt with. It was mainly stuff that was going to go to the High Court. I mean, there was low-level stuff like house breakings, car theft, all that stuff. But as the years went by, the CID dealt with less and less of that stuff. So I stayed at Bear Street for a couple of years and then said, no, this is not for me. I want to go back. And I ended up then going to a surveillance unit based at Pitt Street. And I was there for 4 years. And that was probably 4 of the best years in my career in terms of the level and of work that we were dealing with and how much we were dealing with it. But it was interesting in the sense of how the bosses in Pitt Street saw it. First of all, I couldn't understand why they were based at Pitt Street. Because anybody else who had squads of any description and any forces throughout the rest of the UK would have them out with their offices, so that you weren't having to deal with vehicles and stuff you were using, getting seen coming out of a police office. But anyway, it was interesting, and we had some other really, really good cases we got involved in there as well, and a wide scope of varying type of things. But again, mainly drugs. Mainly it was drugs-based stuff we dealt with, but we also dealt with robberies. We are down to following murder suspects. I remember following a murder suspect about in Ayr for days till they got enough evidence to actually collar this guy. That was interesting because as I remember, the guy it was a murder of a female and a violent murder down there. And in surveillance work, you've got female officers working with you because that's the best thing, especially when you're going to be going in close to guys. If you've got cover in the sense of you look like a couple, it works very well. But I remember following this guy about for days and days and thinking, you were really worried at certain situations where he went into areas or places where it was almost like we're going to have to arrest this guy, you know, but we don't want to expose the fact that we're there. Eventually it didn't come to that, and they got enough evidence and they arrested the guy. But we were on this guy 24/7 for 3 or 4 days until they gathered enough evidence to actually
make an arrest.
To make an arrest.
That's something that I was curious about in the sense of, and I've read a few books about people that have been in the police and they've went through obviously various ranks, and when they are maybe investigating, be it a murder case, or be it a sexual assault or something of that nature, and they maybe question these people, does it kind of open your eyes a little bit to the fact that there is human beings out there that have got that in their makeup that they can go and do something like that, and kind of, yeah, some people will be remorseful, but there is an element of people who are completely kind of in a different place.
Absolutely. I remember clearly one of the most interesting interviews I did was a guy who had been it's quite a well-known case, but this guy had been a doctor in the SAS, Scottish guy, and he had gone to Iraq, and at some point during his service there, he, like quite a lot of guys, had acquired a firearm. In this case, it was an AK-47, and he brought it back with him to the UK, unbeknownst to anybody.
Yeah.
And he kept it.
Right.
And at some point, this guy had a fallout with his girlfriend, who was a nurse at the same hospital he worked with, and he murdered her. He waited till she came out of the hospital and he shot her with an AK-47. He then came back up to Scotland, and there was intelligence came into our office that this guy was coming up to Scotland, and we had to scramble and go and try and track him down. But it wasn't as simple as that because of the fact he was armed.
Yeah.
So there had to be a whole firearms team and all the rest of it. Anyway, cut a long story short, the guy got arrested. And myself and my neighbour ended up interviewing this guy. And what was really interesting about him was that he was convinced, really, basically, that everybody else, you know, didn't know enough to deal with what he was dealing with, and you know, couldn't understand the situation he was going through, and but he's one of the few guys I think I've ever spoken to, and I thought he knew exactly what he was doing. He went and did it, and he was trying to make excuses for what had happened.
Yeah.
Including the way the firearm operated. You know, Kalashnikovs work in two different ways.
Yeah.
They have a single shot or an automatic fire. And I remember him trying to put up as a defence straight away the fact that he mistakenly put it on to automatic instead of single shot. And he only meant to frighten this woman, which was complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah.
And the whole evidence that was gathered at the scene by the police down in Yorkshire did not meet up with that.
Yeah.
But if that answers your question, that was interesting to get in the mind of somebody like that. Guys like him are few and far between.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the guys we dealt with at a serious level, what I would call the good Neds, the higher level criminals who'd made their way up from where they were when I went to work in Saracen, who are now kingpins, if you want to use that paper phrase.
Yeah.
When they were caught, they didn't say anything to you.
Yeah.
And the people underneath them didn't say anything to you. Again, for obvious reasons. Why would they? Because they knew if they spoke to the police, there was only one thing happening thereafter, and it wasn't going to be something they were going to want to happen to them.
Yeah.
So they generally didn't speak to the police. So a lot of interviews were short and to the point, peppered with the 2 words, no comment.
So you see in most TV shows now, when you see like the ones where they're behind the scenes, and it is just that constant stream of, is that frustrating being in your shoes, or is it just expected?
No, by that time it was expected, but a no comment interview is can also still be very useful evidence, because you know you're putting things to them and they're no commenting it. I've had guys, really top level guys, who said no comment to their name and their address, which made me laugh. Yeah, you know, and I always did have a bit of a laugh. Yeah, you know, usually off tape with these guys, you know, and I would say to them, you do realise that giving your name and address or whatever is really not incriminating you.
I suppose, but
you can give it.
You've seen a lot of people from when they're maybe young and they've kind of climbed up to wherever they are, and that relationship changes, I suppose, over time. Or as you say, when you first come in and you would kind of speak to the lads, etc., but then as they climb their ladder and you climb yours, that relationship kind of goes further and further away from each other, it totally changes.
Yeah, it does change, but it was a technique. As I say, I've dealt and interviewed with sex offenders, all sorts of people. You know, I took the attitude that, as I say, despite how it might have stuck in your stomach or whatever, again, you deal with people from a respectful point of view, no matter what they've dealt with, and you deal with it from a professional point of view. Because you're not there to judge individuals. You can do that privately if you want, but from a professional point of view, what you're there to do is you're there to gather evidence. And if you can do that by interviewing them and by getting admissions out of them, or even non-admissions out of them in some cases, it's a skill. And you learn that skill. And sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes you get to speak to people who you expect them to say nothing. And for whatever reason, they want to tell you their whole life story, including what they've done. And that never ceased to amaze me, the amount of times that did happen. In surveillance terms, usually the first opening gambit was, oh, I knew you guys were following me. To which I would usually say, well, if you knew that, you wouldn't be sitting here, would you? You know?
I suppose, but the thing that I was kind of wondering, and I always kind of, when you read a lot of these books and you speak to people who've been in the police, it's, what about the ones that get away? And you've maybe questioned people and you've got that inkling, you know they've done it, but you just can't get that final. Do you find it easy to let those ones go?
Absolutely.
Or do you still kind of think on them?
No, I don't think about them at all, because at the end of the day, if the evidence is not there, it's not there. You know, we're not living in you know, the movies where people find and deal with that evidence if they have to. So we weren't living in, I was never going to be the guy that was going down that route. So as far as I was concerned, if the evidence wasn't there and people weren't willing to tell you what they'd done for whatever reason, that's fine. That's fine. There's plenty of other people out there, and you know, aside from, you know, getting admissions out of people who weren't going to admit things to you, you gathered enough evidence over the years, and you know, as I say, we started to hone our skills and our techniques and all the rest of it to be able to target these individuals at a higher level, and that's what happened. In a lot of those cases I dealt with during that period. But that was a 4 years. A lot of these squad things were a secondment. So you went from your force, or you went to work in the Scottish Crime Squad, or you went for 4 years to work in the surveillance, and then you had to go back again. That was horrible. I hated that. And in 1998, I finished my 4 years there, and I went to work in Pollock. And Pollock, for me, I had never seen anywhere like that in my life. I had worked 11 years in Saracen, and I was shocked at the level of poverty and deprivation somewhere in Glasgow. I mean, I'd seen plenty of sites. You know, I mean, I'd been in houses in Saracen where people were burning the floorboards in an open fire. You know, in a tenement. I'd seen kids running about that hadn't had an nappy change for 3 or 4 days. But when I went to work in Pollock, I was shocked at the level of deprivation, and that was all addiction based. It was either drugs or it was drink, and it really was. By that time, I was thinking to myself, "This is not what I want to be doing." And I remember, I've told the story to various people. I remember the first murder I dealt with when I went to Pollock. I'd only been there maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And the first murder I dealt with was a 13-year-old victim and a 14-year-old accused. And I thought to myself,
where to even begin with that?
This is how do you process that? And literally from that day till the day I left that division, it was in that area, it was violence, and violence. That was Govan division. And it was just murders, attempt murders, serious assaults, rapes, all that stuff. That was another division where it was a really, really busy office. And but it was all violence related. And most of the violence in the majority of cases was drink related. And young guys getting into fights and stabbing people, as I say, a 14-year-old and a 13-year-old. And I just thought, this is hopeless. Absolutely. And I made my mind up very quickly when I went there that I didn't want to be doing that. I wanted to be back doing what I'd done before. And eventually I was very lucky because the guy who was the detective chief inspector and then became a detective super, I'd worked with him as a cop, so I knew him very well. And after 18 months or whatever, I sort of went to him and I said to him, look, this is not for me. I don't want, mentally, emotionally, I've had enough of this. I've dealt with violence throughout my police career. This is not for me. Don't get me wrong, people love to come to these areas because in those days they were getting paid lots of overtime and stuff like that. But I couldn't quite equate myself with that idea that, people were happy to earn money. How are we earning money here? We're earning money because people are getting murdered, serious assault and all the rest of it. And we worked and we worked and we worked. And some of these offices I worked in, I didn't, I didn't get a day off for weeks and weeks and weeks. I told the guys a story one time before here about that wasn't when I worked in Pollock, when I worked in Baird Street. My wife and my two kids were just toddlers at that time. And I'd been working days and days without a day off. And the guy at the bar, the uniformed cop, came through to the CID office and said, your wife's here for you. I thought, is she here for her? Something happened? Something's wrong. And I walked in and she looked at me and she looked at the kids and said, that's your dad. I mean, she was there to pick me up, but I mean, that was how ridiculous things were, because I would go out early morning and not come back till late, silly time, just working 12 or 14-hour shifts. Or if something happened, sometimes you were there for 24 hours before you got a relief. And when I went to Pollock, it was just more and more and more of that. And I thought, no, that's not for me. And as I say, I approached this guy and said to him, and he said, well, look, you need to just keep your head down for a few more months or whatever. I think that was the summertime, and by November or December, in just under 2 years, I was away again and back to the Scottish Crime Squad, or by that time it then became the Scottish Crime Enforcement Agency, and then the SCDA, the Drug and Crime Enforcement Agency. And I spent the rest of my career there, which was absolutely fantastic. I loved that. I mean, by that time, things had progressed in terms of equipment and technology and all the rest of it, and we were dealing with things at a much higher level. And some of the cases were crossing not just borders in Scotland, England, Europe, internationally. So some stuff that we worked on was really interesting, and we'd a wide scope of cases. It was all drugs. In the main. Although we dealt with other stuff as well. But it was all basically drugs related.
Which is funny, from when you first came in and you seen that kind of starting point to when you had left, and it was global at that point from just coming into Saracen.
It gone global, so in what's a relatively short period of time from 1981 to 2000 or whenever that was. I'm trying to think, so 94 to 98. But 1999, I think I went back, 2000, and spent the last 8 years of my career doing that type of work. So within a relatively short period of time, drugs had gone from being a local thing within Scotland or the UK to these guys making connections direct with people from the other side of the world. So at the same time as the police were honing their skills, these guys were honing their skills as well. But things were becoming easier because by that time you had the internet, you had, satellite phones, you had all sorts of stuff. So it was a lot easier. But again, as I say, my opinion was that there wasn't enough put into it in terms of what the government did. I said that to senior officers right up till the day I left, and I ended up, when I left the police, I ended up working as a civilian for 11 years and dealing with intelligence work. And I had spoken to some quite senior officers and voiced that opinion as well, and some of them agreed and some didn't agree. Because my attitude was and is, if people were dying on the streets of Chelsea or Westminster or the posh houses in Edinburgh where the Scottish Government ministers are based, things might be different. But they're not dying there. They're dying in the schemes in Glasgow. They're dying in Saracen. They're dying in Easterhouse. They're dying in Pollock, Castlemilk, or they're dying in schemes in Liverpool and Manchester, or Wester Hailes in Edinburgh, or up in Dundee, Aberdeen, wherever else it is. And it doesn't seem to come onto the agenda that every year we have thousands of people dying. We have a pandemic, and there's a obviously, quite rightly, there's a national emergency, and everybody deals with it and everybody pitches in. But these people slip through the crack year after year after year, and seem to just be accepted that that's just the way it is. I don't subscribe to the idea, that you win the war against drugs or anything like that. I'm not suggesting you're going to eradicate drugs from society, but I think we're now, and I have heard senior officers now, I believe one assistant chief or deputy chief constable has recently alluded to the fact that he thinks that people caught in possession of a small amount of drugs for personal use, whether it's Class A drugs like heroin or cocaine or marijuana, cannabis, shouldn't be prosecuted anymore. And I think that's a start on the road. We've also heard talk about providing rooms where people can safely take drugs and all the rest of it. I mean, like all of these things, there's got to be a mixed agency approach to the problem. And as I say, that was something I found very interesting when I went to work at the Drugs Enforcement Agency latterly. Was by that time they based themselves in a complex where there was us and there was Customs and Excise, which then became HMRC. And then latterly, that then led to what is now the crime campus at Cosh, where they have all sorts of people all based together. And that's all about trying to have a joined up idea towards fighting criminality. And that's the way to go. But as I say, when we're still having thousands of people dying every year in Scotland and throughout this country, we've got to start thinking of more innovative ways of dealing, and we've got to stop thinking of these people as criminals and think of them to some extent as victims. Because in a lot of cases, I'll go right back to the beginning where we came in. In 1978 in Saracen, there were 3 engineering works, the Blind Craft, the Ascot, and the City Bakery. So lots of opportunity for people to work. By the time I left there in 1989, there was nothing. And drugs had come into Saracen. Now that picture was replicated throughout Scotland in the 80s and the UK. I mean, you offer people no hope whatsoever in these areas, especially a lot of them who didn't have the skills other than to be able to do manual work. But a lot of them are very clever people as well.
Yeah.
You know, people that worked in these engineering works and all the rest of it. But there was no opportunity left for people in these areas like Possilpark to work.
Mm-hmm.
And then you brought in drink, which had always been there, but then you topped that up with drugs.
Yeah.
So you gave people no hope. There was no hope, and that then makes them turn to stuff like drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And their life becomes even more hopeless, more chaotic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's then becomes generational, because then their kids see what's going on. And you maybe end up with, by the time I left, people who were second or third generation had never worked in their life and had no chance of getting a job.
Yeah. Stuck in that
loop.
Yeah.
That spiral of poverty and deprivation and lack of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So, and all the mental chaos that goes along with that.
Yeah.
And fortunately, now people are starting to get involved with these things and are addressing that. You know, one of the groups, a group I worked with, started working with is Brothers in Arms.
Mm-hmm.
So the mental health crisis in Glasgow and a lot of the suicides that are happening, a lot of them can be traced back to that lack of opportunity or issues with addiction.
Mm-hmm.
I know. Again, talking to prison officers, I have done in the past that the suicides they dealt with in the jail were a lot of them were drugs based as well. So we've got to think out of the box here in terms of what we're doing. Yeah, you know, because you can't win the war. You've got to find a way of giving people opportunities to take themselves out of that area. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and take themselves out of that zone where they have hopelessness and nothing else. Yeah, you know, as I say, I worked in all these areas. I worked in. I met loads of decent people, loads of really good people, and latterly people who were like, you know, a lot of times you've probably seen a lot of these groups in Glasgow where it's grannies and stuff like that who are getting together and trying to organise things for people so that they don't get involved in stuff like that. And funding youth clubs and funding schemes and stuff like that to get kids away from that sort of thing and get them involved in something else. Yeah. So as I say, I think now I'm out of it now. I mean, I retired a couple of years ago from the job I worked as a civilian. So I mean, I was involved with the police, 30 years as a police officer, and another 11 years as working for the police. Yeah. So 41 years of involvement in crime, and a lot of it serious crime, and a lot of it drugs and intelligence work. Yeah. So things have changed massively in that time. And it's interesting to see how things will change moving forward. You know? Yeah,
100%. And I suppose when we touch on the kind of chances for people in trying to get careers and trying to get into work, based obviously on the career you've had, what advice would you give to people who are potentially looking at the police as a career? Because obviously you've spanned 4 decades, so you've seen massive changes across the board, but based on your own experiences, what advice would you give?
Well, I thought about this when I was trying to prep for this, and the first thing I would go back to what we talked about originally. And the first thing is, if you want to join the police and it's a career path you see ahead of you, then go into it with the idea that you're going to treat people with respect. You're there to do a job. You're not there to judge people. Yeah. You're there to help them, mainly. That's why I went into the police. You know, I realised that fairly, early in my career that really why I'd chosen it was because I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to arrest the bad guys and I wanted to see them in the jail, but I wanted to see them in the jail because they were doing bad things to good people most of the time. So I think you need to go into it with that attitude. I think it's very difficult to offer advice in terms of anything else other than, you've got to be true to yourself and you've got to look at it and you've got to say, am I going to be able to deal with what's going to be presented in front of me? And if you do decide to do it, then you go in and you listen and learn and you will get there. It's sometimes going to be hard. You're going to be exposed to, I think the police officers nowadays are exposed to a lot more violence upon them than we were. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, I've had knives presented at me. I've been in situations where I've thought, this is it. Yeah. I'm not going to come through this fighting with people on the streets. Yeah. And I was never a big tough guy. I'm a skinny guy, but it's amazing what can happen when your adrenaline gets going and you think your life's in danger. Yeah. So I would say think very carefully about it, but go into it with the attitude that you're joining it because it should really be a job where you want to make a difference and you want to help the community. Yeah. Things have changed. You can't judge the way police work now based on what they did in the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s. Yeah. I remember initially being in a couple of Facebook groups for ex-cops, and I was never really into stuff like that. But somebody said to me, "Oh, you go on, there's a bit of banter and do all that stuff." And I went on to it, and I came off after about a month or something because it was all old cops trying to berate young cops about how they were behaving or what they did or, the way they dressed or the way they dealt with situations. And it's incompatible. Yeah. It's not for those that have gone before to judge what's happening now because it's like people asking you the question, is Pelé the greatest footballer ever, or is it Davy Cooper or Henrik Larsson or whatever, Yeah. You can't compare the two things. You can't compare Ronaldo with Pelé because you're talking about different eras. Yeah. And it's the same with policing. So in that sense, things have changed. But in basic terms, they've not changed. Yeah. You're there to do a job. You're there to serve the community. And that's what you should join the police for. You shouldn't join it because you want to lock people up. Yeah. Or you want to wear a uniform. Yeah. Or you want to be full of your own self-importance. And I worked with plenty of guys like that. Yeah. Plenty of guys who was all about wearing the uniform and being a policeman and being self-important. And when these guys retired and left the police, they had nothing. Yeah. Their whole life collapsed about them because they'd gone from being one day somebody who was really important to somebody who was just another,
not ready for it.
And they weren't ready for it. So I think you go into it with your eyes open. I took the attitude that I didn't want to be a uniform officer all my career, and I sought out opportunities to do that. Yeah. But if somebody wants to join the police and be a uniform cop all their life, walk the beat, do whatever they do now, that's fine. But I would always say to people, if you're going to join the police now, do it with an open mind and go into it and think, I'm going to try everything. Yeah. I never turned down any courses. Yeah. When I was offered courses, I took all of them because I thought you're always going to learn something. Yeah. And latterly in my career, when people said to me, "Oh, we need somebody to go and speak with customs or social work or whatever it was, or any other forms of investigators who were dealing with things, I was always happy to go and do that.
Yeah.
Because I like talking to people and I like learning from other people what they were all about, what their backstory was, and how they'd come to be in that position.
Yeah.
Because I think if you do that, not only in work, but in life, you're getting a much better idea of what people are all about.
Yeah.
And especially if you do it in the police, then what you're able to do is you're able to do your job in a holistic way, not just judging people superficially. You can look at them and their situation in a more rounded manner.
Yeah.
And you can deal with people as human beings and deal with them more sympathetically. Whereas if you get in with the attitude that we're this and they're the enemy, end of situation, I think it's very difficult for you to get through your time in the police. So I didn't do that. You know, I went through my career with an open mind.
Yeah.
Any situation that mainly caused conflict in me was that back in the early days in the police there was a great culture of bullying, and you did get certain individuals. Thankfully, hopefully, all that's changed now. But you know, like any job, you'll situations like that you'll have to confront. So again, I would say to guys and girls that want to apply for the police, just be assertive, be confident, be able to deal with these things. Otherwise, they can come back to haunt you later on in your life. So that's the advice I would give people, as I say. Approach it with that attitude, and you'll not go wrong. You know.
Jamie, this has been brilliant. I've actually sat here like a sponge, just taking all of this in, and I mean that in the nicest way. And I think it gets exactly what people have contacted me looking for, because they might go and look on like career websites, etc., and get a kind of very brief overview of what it means to be a police officer and what it entails. But I think it's very different when you listen to someone who's lived that job for X number of years. No matter what era that was from, it's still essentially police work. You want to be in it for the same reasons, and it's so good to get that path from coming in at the beginning, learning your trade, to going to CID, going to surveillance, going to drug enforcement. So many different areas and so much knowledge that you've gained from that as well. Absolutely appreciate it, mate. It's been
not a problem.
Immense. Thank you.
It's been really enjoyable speaking to you. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, mate. Cheers.